Really grateful for the invitation. Thanks very much. Grateful to ADR UK and ESRC for funding our work, and to the EEF and DFE for supporting it. Really interesting conference and sessions. Interesting to hear about all these different strands of work. I'm going to talk to you about a project that first began as an idea about 5 years ago, if not longer, but has only really become reality in the last year. And the very short version is that we're following up completed randomised controlled trials in education to look at alternative outcomes. That might make you ask, why are we doing this? And you can probably guess at some of these reasons, but it's worth spelling out some of them. The first is really, we don't really know what the long-term effects of interventions are. And we know from different fields that it's typical to see fade out or so-called voltage drop when a programme is delivered at a larger scale or outcomes are measured over a longer time frame. And lots of things don't work. The second reason for doing these is that doing follow-ups brings its own challenges, but a lot of the hard work has already really been done. And that relates to the next point. The return on investment for reusing the data is phenomenal. Probably the most useful thing I've done so far in this project was to sketch out kind of the ROI for reusing the education trials data, and we can do that relatively easily by saying how much it would cost to rerun a trial and look at a different outcome versus funding a follow-up of a completed trial or trials using admin data. And RCTs and trials in particular are by default about policy. So evaluation, as I view it, is the pointy end of the research stick. Does it work? For whom and where? Under what conditions? And a long-standing criticism of evaluation and research is that it's not directly relevant for policy. So what I'll do is I'll talk to you now about a couple of examples of doing long-term follow-ups, and then I'll come back to the actual project itself. So the first example, it's a very famous study where a high risk but very small sample of kids attended preschool and families got additional support. There was no effect during the lifetime of the project, but long-term follow-up showed differences between intervention and comparison groups across a range of outcomes. What is stark is that these effects pass on through generations. The children of the peri kids fare better than the children of non-participants. So sending kids to high-quality preschool seems to have long-standing positive benefits. Who'd have thought? What about sending kids to summer camp? The great outdoors, loads of activities, camp counsellors, that must be good, right? Well, thanks to Richard Cabot and then generations of researchers after that, notably Joan McCord, we have an answer. Unfortunately, across multiple outcomes, those attending didn't fare better than control kids and actually did worse across 7 outcomes measured. And we know this because they managed to follow up nearly all the kids in the study. Now, it would be an impressive feat to get follow-ups of like 95% for 30 years later for any study, but we have to remember that these follow-ups were happening in the 1960s, meaning that the team were flying and driving across the US to find people and literally going door to door like detectives in some cases. So that's like, it's just a massive amount of effort, and it shows kind of some really important dedication required to do that sort of work. And there's some links to the studies in the slides, and I'll talk. I can send those across. So why am I talking to you about trials from 60 or 80 years ago? I mean, there are other examples that I can talk about. There are more recent. There's a 23-year follow-up in criminology of a domestic violence arrest program in Milwaukee, or research looking at long-term impacts of conditional cash transfers. But the 2 examples I gave illustrate nicely that, for one, effects may not be as intended, and 2, they may not appear until much later on. But really, it's the case in the UK, in the UK in particular, we haven't had quite the same appetite for doing these sorts of projects as other countries, partly because we've not done as many trials. Certainly in social policy anyway. The good news is that's changed. So they're now approaching something like 200 randomised control trials the Education Endowment Foundation have funded, covering hundreds of schools, if not thousands, and tens of thousands of pupils, if not more. And there have been more trials in the last 10 years in education in the UK than in the 30 years before that. And these interventions, these trials, cover a wide range of age groups, intervention ideas. They're high quality studies. Some interventions might have impacts beyond attainment. And what we're working on is a model that can read across to other What Works centres, and that's the real gift here. The possibility of pulling together knowledge and data from across the landscape for young people. And each of the RCTs in the Education Endowment Foundation have funded is a mini longitudinal study, because it typically has a pre and post intervention measure of outcomes. So let's skip on. So really the basic model here is to think about and select interventions that could plausibly have an impact on other outcomes like exclusions and attendance, and that's the focus for the first stage of the work. But the point is that the interventions themselves don't have to have worked in the original trial, and we don't have to limit to educational outcomes. We're starting with attendance and exclusions, but this might expand to arrest, job applications, higher education applications, and so on. And if we start to think about it in these terms, we can make links between interventions and outcomes that might be in different policy areas over many years. And that's partly what the What Works network is for and can do, bridging across policy areas and making those links. And it's possible to imagine making links between initiatives and policy areas. So we're looking to intervene at an area level for economic growth, but we're actually looking at what's happening with children's outcomes. And we have examples of the kind of place-based initiatives like the innovative West London Children's Zone, and that, you know, linking together data and thinking about long-term outcomes using admin data will allow us to kind of look in a much broader range of policy impacts. And we can start to think about other things as well. So look across outcomes and age groups and really start to understand how policies interact with each other over time. And that would really let us turn hundreds of studies into thousands of answers. And there are lots of directions this could go in, but one step at a time, in this case, one trial at a time. Now, a huge step here is getting EEF trials data into the ONS SRS, which is now done. And we're now in the position of choosing which trials to follow up and have started doing that. So a quick recap before I finish up. Really, the focus of the project is looking at long-term impacts using National Pupil Database and other data, new and different outcomes, tracking these impacts over time, looking at fade-out or emergent effects, exploring cumulative impacts, identifying comparative impact of projects on subgroups, and there's also alongside this a methodological piece that can follow that helps understand both the trials themselves, but also think about future research projects. Now, all of this is really bundled together with a clear focus on answering policy questions and helping us more to understand more about how we intervene, when and with whom. And I'll stop there. Thanks for your time.